Lieutenant Jake Morrison had attended enough diplomatic receptions to know that survival depended on three simple rules: keep your drinks light, your comments neutral, and your eyes on appropriate conversational partners. Unfortunately, as he stood in the opulent reception hall of the luxury cruise liner Celestial Harmony, he was about to violate all three rules in spectacular fashion. The reception was meant to strengthen interspecies relations between the Terran Defense Corps and various allied military commands. Jake's job was simple: represent humanity professionally, make polite conversation with alien dignitaries, and avoid creating any incidents that might require apologetic communiques from higher command. He was failing at all of the above. The problem was Commander Zara Lin of the Cytherian Naval Command, whose presence in the reception hall had been systematically destroying Jake's ability to focus on anything else. The Cytherians were known throughout the galaxy for their striking appearance: tall, elegant beings with skin that shifted through subtle color changes based on their emotional state. Their pointed ears and angular features gave them an otherworldly beauty that had made them favorites in interspecies cultural exchanges. Zara Lin embodied all of these characteristics and more. She moved through the crowd with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to command, her ceremonial uniform perfectly tailored to show off a figure that belonged in classical sculpture. Her skin currently showed the pale blue tones that indicated professional focus, and her silver hair was arranged in the complex braids that marked her high rank. Jake had been trying not to stare at her for the past hour, with limited success. "Impressive display of alien diplomacy, isn't it?" commented Lieutenant Sarah Kim, joining Jake at his position near the observation windows. She followed his gaze across the room to where Zara Lin was engaged in animated conversation with a group of Centaurian trade representatives. "Yeah," Jake replied without thinking, his brain apparently deciding to take a vacation at the worst possible moment. "Especially that Cytherian commander's ass, it's absolutely perfect." The words hung in the air like a plasma grenade with a faulty timer. Jake's brain came screaming back online just in time to register that the conversation around them had died, that heads were turning in their direction, and that he had just committed what was possibly the worst diplomatic faux pas in the history of interspecies relations. The reception hall, which moments before had buzzed with polite conversation in a dozen different languages, fell into the kind of silence that usually preceded court-martial proceedings. Jake could feel the stares of every diplomat, officer, and dignitary in the room boring into him like targeting lasers. "Oh no," Sarah whispered beside him. "Oh, Jake, no. Please tell me you didn't just..." "I did," Jake said faintly, watching as Zara Lin slowly turned around to face him. Her skin was shifting through color changes he couldn't interpret, and her expression was unreadable. "I definitely just did." The Cytherian commander studied him from across the room with the kind of intense focus that Jake associated with predators selecting their prey. Her pointed ears were tilted forward in what he hoped was curiosity rather than homicidal intent, and her eyes, large and dark with flecks of silver, seemed to be cataloging everything about him for future reference. Jake considered his options. He could try to apologize, though that would require crossing the reception hall under the stares of several dozen witnesses. He could attempt to flee, though that would probably trigger an interspecies incident and definitely end his career. He could faint, which was looking increasingly attractive as a viable escape strategy. Before he could decide on a course of action, Zara Lin began walking toward him. The crowd parted before her like she was generating her own gravitational field, and Jake noticed that her skin had shifted to a warm golden tone that he suspected meant something significant in Cytherian emotional communication. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could catch the subtle scent of something like cinnamon and starlight that seemed to surround her. Her height meant that even in his dress uniform boots, Jake had to look up slightly to meet her eyes. "Lieutenant Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality that made Cytherian speech so distinctive. "I believe you have something to say to me." Jake's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. Every diplomatic protocol he'd ever learned had abandoned him, leaving him with nothing but the certainty that he was about to become a cautionary tale taught at military academies for the next century. That is. "Commander, I sincerely apologize for my inappropriate comment," he finally managed. "It was unprofessional, disrespectful, and accurate." Zaralyn interrupted, her skin shifting to a deeper gold that seemed to glow in the reception hall's lighting. Jake blinked. I'm sorry, what? Zaralyn smiled, revealing teeth that were slightly sharper than human standard, and Jake felt his heart rate increase for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Your assessment of my posterior anatomy. Was it accurate? The reception hall was so quiet that Jake could hear his own heartbeat. He was dimly aware that several diplomats had pulled out recording devices, as if they wanted to document what was clearly going to be either a historic moment in interspecies relations or the most spectacular career implosion in military history. Yes. Jake said, the word coming out as more of a question than a statement. Excellent, Zaralyn replied, her smile growing wider. In that case, Lieutenant Morrison, since you seem so interested in Cytherian anatomy, perhaps you'd like a private lesson in our cultural practices. The words carried clearly across the silent reception hall, and Jake heard several gasps from the assembled crowd. Ambassador Chen from the Centaurian delegation looked like he was taking notes. A group of Altoiran naval officers had started what appeared to be a betting pool. Are you? Jake struggled to process what was happening. Are you seriously propositioning me? In front of the entire diplomatic corps. Zaralyn's laugh was like music, bright and genuine. Oh, Lieutenant, you have so much to learn about Cytherian culture. What I'm doing is called combat flirtation, a time-honored tradition among my people for determining romantic compatibility. She stepped closer, her skin now showing swirls of gold and silver that were genuinely mesmerizing. Your crude but honest comment about my physical attributes has initiated what we call the trial of direct desire. If you're brave enough to continue, we'll discover whether your interest goes deeper than surface attraction. Jake looked around the reception hall, taking in the fascinated stares of dozens of witnesses, the barely suppressed excitement of diplomats who were witnessing something unprecedented, and a growing crowd of military personnel who seemed to be treating this as better entertainment than anything they'd seen in years. And if I'm not brave enough? He asked. Zaralyn's expression grew predatory, her skin shifting to deeper tones that seemed to pulse with inner light. Then you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what you missed when you had the chance to court a Cytherian commander. Jake felt a reckless grin spreading across his face as he realized that his embarrassing verbal slip had somehow evolved into the most interesting challenge he'd ever been offered. Commander Zaralyn, he said, straightening to his full height and meeting her eyes directly, I accept your trial. The reception hall erupted in applause, cheers, and what sounded like several different species equivalents of wolf whistles. Jake found himself looking into Zaralyn's eyes, seeing approval and something that might have been anticipation swirling in their silver-flecked depths. Excellent, she said, extending her arm in a formal gesture he recognized as a Cytherian invitation to partnership. Let the trial begin. As Jake took her arm and felt the warmth of her skin through the ceremonial fabric of her uniform, he realized that his tendency to speak without thinking had just gotten him into the most interesting trouble of his life. And judging by Zaralyn's smile, she intended to make sure he remembered every moment of it. What Jake had initially assumed would be a private conversation turned out to be very much a public performance. Zaralyn led him to the center of the reception hall, where she gestured for the crowd to form a circle around them. The assembled diplomats, officers, and dignitaries arranged themselves with the eager anticipation of spectators at a sporting event. For those unfamiliar with Cytherian customs, Zaralyn announced, her voice carrying easily across the hall, combat flirtation is both courtship ritual and intellectual duel. The participants engage in escalating verbal challenges designed to test compatibility, creativity, and courage. Jake felt sweat beading on his forehead as he realized he was about to participate in an alien mating ritual in front of half the diplomatic corps. Commander, when you say combat flirtation, exactly how much combat are we talking about? That depends entirely on how clever you are, Lieutenant, Zaralyn replied, her skin showing swirls of amusement in golden patterns. The tradition requires that each participant present increasingly bold challenges to their potential partner. Failure to meet a challenge results in elimination. Elimination from the courtship, or elimination in the more permanent sense. Zaralyn's laugh drew appreciative murmurs from the Cytherian officers in the crowd. Your species has such dramatic imaginations. No, Lieutenant Morrison, I'm not going to kill you for failing to impress me. Though you might wish I had, depending on how badly you embarrass yourself. Jake looked around the circle of faces, noting that several people were now openly placing bets on the outcome. Lieutenant Kim gave him an encouraging thumbs up, while Ambassador Chen appeared to be live-streaming the event to what Jake hoped wasn't an official diplomatic channel. First challenge, Zara Lin said, stepping closer until they were almost touching. Tell me why a human tactical officer thinks he's worthy of a Cytherian commander's attention. Jake felt his mind go blank for a moment, then forced himself to focus. This was just another tactical situation, unconventional, terrifying, and with stakes he didn't fully understand, but still a problem that could be solved with the right approach. Because, he said, meeting her eyes directly, I'm the only person in this room who was honest enough to say what everyone else was thinking. And because I'm apparently the only one brave enough to accept a challenge from the most formidable woman I've ever met. Zara Lin's skin shifted to deeper gold tones, and Jake caught approving nods from several of the alien observers. Acceptable answer. Second challenge, what makes you think you could keep pace with someone who commands starships and leads military campaigns? This one was easier. Jake felt his confidence growing as he realized that his military experience was actually relevant to whatever was happening. Because I don't just follow orders, I anticipate them. Because I've never met a tactical problem I couldn't solve, including the one where I have to impress a brilliant commander without making a fool of myself in front of the entire galactic diplomatic community. He paused, then added with a slight smile, also, I've studied Cytherian naval tactics extensively. Your victory at the Deneb engagement was a masterpiece of strategic misdirection that's still taught at the War College. The approving murmur from the crowd was louder this time, and Jake noticed that Zara Lin's ears had tilted forward in what he was learning to recognize as pleased attention. Third challenge, she said, stepping even closer, and this one requires demonstration rather than mere words. Show me that you can match my intellectual intensity. Without warning, she began speaking rapidly in what sounded like a combination of tactical analysis and philosophical debate, her words flowing between Standard, Cytherian, and several other languages Jake barely recognized. The challenge was clear, keep up or be left behind. Jake's brain kicked into overdrive, years of tactical training and xenocultural study suddenly proving their worth. He found himself responding to her arguments with counterpoints that drew on everything from human military philosophy to Altaran ethics, matching her rapid-fire delivery with his own stream of analysis and critique. The crowd watched in fascination as the two officers engaged in what appeared to be a real-time debate about military strategy, interspecies relations, and the philosophical implications of command decisions, all conducted at a pace that left most observers struggling to follow the conversation. Impressive, Zara Lin said finally, her skin now showing complex patterns of silver and gold that seemed to shift with her emotional state. You may actually be worth the effort required to train you properly. Jake felt a surge of pride at what was clearly high praise from someone whose opinion was beginning to matter more to him than he'd expected. Train me for what, exactly? For being my partner, of course, Zara Lin replied as if it should have been obvious. Did you think this was just an evening's entertainment? Combat flirtation is serious business, Lieutenant. We don't engage in it lightly. The implication of her words hit Jake like a tactical revelation. Are you saying that by accepting your challenge, I've committed to something more than just a conversation? Much more, Zara Lin confirmed, her smile showing those slightly sharp teeth again. You've entered into what my people call a trial of compatibility. If you pass all the challenges, we proceed to the next phase of Cytherian courtship. Jake felt his mouth go dry. And if I fail? Then you return to your normal duties with an excellent story to tell your grandchildren about the time you almost courted a Cytherian commander, Zara Lin said with cheerful ruthlessness. Though I should mention that the failure rate for humans attempting our courtship rituals is approximately 93%. The crowd around them had grown larger, with more officers and diplomats arriving to witness what was clearly becoming the evening's main attraction. Jake caught sight of Admiral Hayes in the gathering, his commanding officer watching with the expression of someone who couldn't decide whether to be proud or horrified. Fourth challenge, Zara Lin announced, raising her voice to address the entire assembly. This one tests emotional courage. Lieutenant Morrison, tell me something true about yourself that you've never told anyone else. The request hit Jake like a tactical surprise, the kind that could win or lose entire engagements depending on how quickly you adapted. He looked into Zara Lynn's eyes, seeing something deeper than mere curiosity, a genuine desire to know who he was beneath the uniform and the professional competence. I joined the military because I was afraid of being ordinary, he said quietly, his words carrying clearly in the attentive silence. I wanted to matter, to make a difference, to be someone worth remembering. But until tonight, I never thought I was interesting enough to capture the attention of someone extraordinary. Zara Lynn's skin shifted to patterns Jake hadn't seen before, deep gold shot through with silver spirals that seemed to pulse with inner light. And now? Now I'm terrified that I might actually be worth your attention, Jake admitted with an honesty that surprised him. Because that would mean I have something to lose. The response from the crowd was immediate and appreciative. Even the alien dignitaries who didn't fully understand human emotional expressions seemed to recognize the significance of what Jake had revealed. Zara Lynn stepped forward until they were almost touching, her voice dropping to a tone that somehow still carried to every corner of the hall. Fifth and final challenge, Lieutenant Morrison. This one determines whether you have the courage required to be my partner in truth rather than merely in ritual. She gestured toward the reception hall's exit, toward corridors that led to private areas of the cruise ship. Accept my invitation to continue this conversation in private, knowing that what happens next will define the rest of both our careers. Or decline gracefully, with honor intact and no shame attached. Jake looked around the circle of faces, taking in the expectant expressions of dozens of witnesses who were clearly hoping for a dramatic conclusion to the evening's entertainment. Then he looked back at Zara Lynn, seeing in her eyes something that went far beyond cultural performance. Commander, he said, offering her his arm in what he hoped was the appropriate formal gesture, I would be honored to continue our conversation in private. As they walked toward the exit together, Jake could hear the eruption of applause, cheers, and what sounded like several different species placing final bets on the outcome. But all of that faded into background noise as he focused on the woman beside him, whose skin was now showing colors he was beginning to understand meant anticipation mixed with something that might have been hope. Whatever was about to happen in private, Jake realized, would either be the most incredible night of his life or the most spectacular failure. Either way, he was committed now, to the trial, to Zara Lynn, and to discovering whether courage could bridge the gap between species, cultures, and two people who were both terrified of being ordinary. The observation deck of the Celestial Harmony offered a panoramic view of the stars, the vast emptiness of space broken only by the distant glow of nebulae and the running lights of escort vessels maintaining protective formation around the cruise liner. Jake stood at the viewing port beside Zara Lynn, both of them having shed the performance aspects of their public interaction for something more genuine and infinitely more dangerous. So, Jake said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them, how badly did I embarrass myself back there? Zara Lynn's laugh was softer than it had been in the reception hall, more intimate. Her skin had settled into a warm golden tone that seemed to glow in the starlight. Actually, you performed better than most Cytherians would have in their first combat flotation. My people usually train for months before attempting the ritual. Your people usually don't accidentally initiate it by making crude comments about anatomy in front of the diplomatic corps, Jake pointed out. True, Zara Lynn agreed, turning to face him fully. But that's what made it interesting. Genuine spontaneity is rare in formal courtship. Most attempts are so carefully planned and rehearsed that they lose any real meaning. Jake studied her profile in the starlight, noting details he hadn't been able to see clearly in the crowded reception hall. Her pointed ears were delicately shaped, currently tilted in a way that suggested relaxed attention. Her silver hair caught the light in ways that seemed almost luminescent, and her angular features held a beauty that was both alien and somehow familiar. Can I ask you something? He said. When I made that comment, which, for the record, I am still mortified about, were you actually offended, or were you just intrigued? Zara Lynn considered the question seriously. Both, initially. The crude nature of your observation was jarring, but the honesty behind it was refreshing. Most humans I've encountered in diplomatic settings are so careful to avoid acknowledging physical attraction that they become almost sexless. You, on the other hand, clearly have no filter between your thoughts and your mouth. I'm working on that, Jake said ruefully. Though apparently not very successfully. Don't work too hard on it, Zaralyn replied, moving closer to the viewing port. Cytherians value directness. We find the human tendency to talk around subjects rather than addressing them directly to be frustrating. She gestured toward the stars beyond the transparent aluminum. In my culture, if you're attracted to someone, you say so. If you want to pursue them, you make that clear. If you're interested in a permanent bond, you don't waste time with subtle hints and coded language. Jake felt his heart rate increase. And when you said I'd entered a trial of compatibility, how serious were you being? Completely serious, Zaralyn said, turning to meet his eyes directly. Combat flirtation isn't a game, Jake. It's how Cytherians determine whether two people have the intellectual, emotional, and cultural compatibility necessary for a successful partnership. Partnership as in the kind of bond that lasts a lifetime, Zaralyn said simply. We don't engage in casual romantic relationships. When Cytherians choose a mate, we choose for permanence. The weight of that statement settled between them like a gravity well. Jake found himself reassessing everything that had happened in the reception hall, realizing that what he'd thought was flirtation and performance had actually been something much more significant. Zaralyn, he said carefully, I need you to understand that when I made that comment, I wasn't trying to initiate anything permanent. I was just admiring the view, if you'll forgive the expression. I know, she replied with a smile that seemed to hold depths he was still learning to read. That's what made it genuine. You weren't trying to impress me or manipulate me or position yourself for some advantage. You just saw something you found attractive and said so, without calculation or artifice. She moved closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. Do you know how rare that is, Jake? How unusual it is to encounter someone who responds to attraction with simple honesty rather than strategy. Jake felt himself being drawn into depths he hadn't expected. And now? What are we doing now? Now we're discovering whether that initial honesty can develop into something deeper, Zaralyn said. Whether you're interested in me as a person, or whether your attraction was purely physical. It wasn't, Jake said without hesitation. I mean, it started that way. I'd have to be blind not to notice that you're beautiful. But watching you command that room, seeing how you turned my embarrassing mistake into something. I don't know, something that felt like possibility rather than disaster. That was when I realized I wanted to know more about who you are. Zaralyn's skin shifted to deeper gold tones, and Jake was beginning to understand that this represented pleasure or approval in Cytherian emotional expression. Tell me what you see when you look at me now. Jake studied her face in the starlight, trying to put into words something that felt too complex for simple language. I see someone who's brilliant enough to command starships and confident enough to turn a diplomatic reception into your personal courtship arena. I see someone who's kind enough to give an embarrassed human officer a chance to redeem himself, but strong enough to make sure he earns it. He paused, then continued with the kind of honesty that had gotten him into this situation in the first place. I also see someone who's probably way out of my league, but who for some reason seems willing to find out if we're compatible anyway. Out of your league, Zaralyn repeated, her tone suggesting she found the concept amusing. Jake, you successfully navigated combat flirtation with someone who's been training in it since childhood. You matched my intellectual challenges, showed emotional courage when I asked for honesty, and accepted a trial whose implications you didn't fully understand. What exactly do you think qualifies as your league? Jake felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with recognition. Are you saying I passed your trial? I'm saying you've passed the preliminary challenges, Zaralyn replied with a smile that was both promise and warning. But Jake, I need you to understand what accepting my full courtship would mean. Cytherian bonds aren't just romantic partnerships, they're professional alliances, intellectual collaborations, and lifelong commitments to supporting each other's goals and ambitions. She gestured toward the stars again, and Jake realized she was indicating something specific about their respective careers. I'm being considered for promotion to Fleet Admiral, which would make me one of the youngest officers ever to achieve that rank in Cytherian Naval Command. The partnership I choose will affect not just my personal life, but my professional trajectory and political standing. And you're wondering if a human lieutenant is worth the complications that would bring to your career, Jake said, understanding beginning to dawn. I'm wondering if you're prepared for the complications it would bring to yours, Zaralyn corrected. Interspecies partnerships at our level of military service are unusual. There would be scrutiny, political considerations, cultural challenges that neither of us has experienced navigating. Jake looked out at the stars, thinking about everything that had brought him to this moment, his fear of being ordinary, his desire to matter, his growing fascination with the extraordinary woman beside him who seemed to see possibilities where he saw only complications. Zaralyn, he said finally, 6 hours ago, my biggest concern was avoiding embarrassment at a diplomatic reception. Now I'm being offered the chance to explore a relationship with someone who challenges every assumption I've had about partnership, compatibility, and what it means to find someone worth the risk. He turned to face her fully, meeting her eyes with the same directness she'd shown him. I can't promise I'll be good at navigating the politics or the cultural challenges. I can't even promise I won't embarrass you again with my spectacular lack of filter. But I can promise that if you're willing to take this chance, I'll do everything in my power to be worthy of it. Zaralyn's skin shifted to patterns Jake had never seen before, complex spirals of gold and silver that seemed to pulse with inner light. Jake Morrison, she said softly, are you formally accepting Cytherian courtship with all its implications and obligations? Jake felt the weight of the moment, the sense that his answer would define not just the immediate future but the entire trajectory of his life. Yes, he said simply. I am. When Zaralyn kissed him, her lips warm and soft against his, Jake realized that his tendency to speak without thinking had just gotten him into the most wonderful trouble of his life. And judging by the way her skin was glowing in patterns that seemed to reflect starlight itself, she intended to make sure neither of them ever forgot how it all began. 6 months after the diplomatic reception that had changed both their lives, Jake stood in the Joint Tactical Command Center of the Terran-Cytherian Alliance, watching Zaralyn coordinate a complex military exercise that involved ships from 12 different species. Her promotion to Fleet Admiral had come through 2 months earlier, making her the youngest officer in Cytherian history to achieve that rank, and Jake had never been more proud of anyone in his life. Admiral, he said, approaching her command station with a tactical analysis datapad, the Altaïran cruiser squadron is reporting some difficulty integrating with the Centaurian defensive formation. Recommendations? Zaralyn looked up from her holographic displays, her skin showing the focused blue tones that indicated deep concentration. What does our human tactical perspective suggest, Major Morrison? Jake still felt a thrill at hearing his new rank. The promotion had come with his assignment to the Joint Command, recognition of his unique ability to bridge human tactical thinking with alien strategic approaches. Realign the Centaurian formation to accommodate Altaïran turning radii, then use the combined formation as a mobile anvil against the enemy's projected advance. Elegant solution, Zaralyn approved, her skin shifting to warm gold. Implement it. As Jake moved to coordinate the exercise modifications, he reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed since that night on the observation deck. The political complications Zaralyn had warned him about had materialized exactly as predicted, committee hearings about the propriety of interspecies partnerships in high-level military positions, media attention that ranged from fascinated to scandalous, and cultural challenges that required them to essentially invent new protocols for everything from joint assignments to formal military events. But the benefits had outweighed the complications in ways neither of them had anticipated. Their partnership had proven so effective that they'd become the template for a new kind of joint command structure, combining human tactical creativity with Cytherian strategic discipline to create military solutions that neither species could have developed alone. Major Morrison, called Lieutenant Commander Sarah Kim from the communications station, were receiving a priority transmission from Admiral Hayes. It's marked for both you and Admiral Zaralyn. Jake and Zaralyn exchanged glances, both recognizing that priority transmissions from high command usually meant either excellent news or significant problems. They moved to the secure communications booth, where Admiral Hayes's familiar face appeared on the holographic display. Admiral Zaralyn, Major Morrison, Hayes said without preamble, I'm calling to inform you that your joint tactical innovations have been selected for implementation across all Alliance military commands. The Defense Council wants you to head the new interspecies military integration program. Jake felt his breath catch. The IMIP was something they'd proposed months ago, a comprehensive training program designed to help military personnel from different species work more effectively together. Getting approval for the program would mean recognition for their work on a galactic scale. Sir, Zara Lynn replied, her skin shifting to colors Jake recognized as cautious optimism. We're honored by the confidence, but that would require significant resources and authority levels that. Which you'll have, Hayes interrupted with a slight smile. The program comes with its own command structure, unlimited access to Alliance training facilities, and authority to work directly with military leadership from all member species. Jake looked at Zara Lynn, seeing the same mixture of excitement and apprehension in her eyes that he felt. Admiral Hayes, what would this mean for our current assignments? It would mean you'd be working together permanently, developing and implementing the training protocols that will shape interspecies military cooperation for the next generation, Hayes explained. It's essentially a blank check to revolutionize how Alliance forces operate together. After Hayes signed off, Jake and Zara Lynn stood in a communications booth, both processing the magnitude of what they'd just been offered. This is everything we've worked toward, Zara Lynn said quietly. The chance to prove that interspecies partnerships aren't just possible, but essential for effective military cooperation. It's also a massive responsibility, Jake pointed out. If we fail, we won't just be damaging our own careers, we'll be setting back interspecies relations for decades. Zara Lynn's skin shifted to the complex patterns of gold and silver that Jake had learned meant she was working through multiple layers of analysis. Are you having second thoughts about accepting? Are you kidding? Jake replied with a grin. 6 months ago, I was a lieutenant who couldn't keep his mouth shut at diplomatic receptions. Now I'm being offered the chance to reshape Alliance military doctrine with the most brilliant strategic mind I've ever encountered. If I'm dreaming, don't wake me up. You're not dreaming, Zara Lynn said, moving closer to him in the privacy of the booth. Though sometimes I feel like I must be. When you made that ridiculous comment about my anatomy, I never imagined it would lead to this. She gestured at the tactical displays visible through the booth's transparent walls, indicating not just their current command center but everything they'd built together. A partnership that's changed both our careers, influenced Alliance military policy, and somehow managed to work despite every cultural obstacle we've encountered. Jake reached out and took her hands, noting how her skin warmed under his touch. Do you regret any of it? The complications, the scrutiny, the way our relationship became public property? Never, Zara Lynn said without hesitation. Though I do sometimes wonder what would have happened if you'd kept that particular observation to yourself. We probably would have spent the entire reception making polite conversation and never spoken again, Jake replied honestly. Sometimes the best things come from the worst timing and the most embarrassing circumstances. Is that what you tell people when they ask how we met? Jake's grin widened. I tell them that I accidentally initiated Cytherian courtship rituals by making inappropriate comments in front of the diplomatic corps, and that you were kind enough to give me a chance to prove I was worth the trouble. And are you worth the trouble? Jake looked around their command center, taking in the mixed species crew that had learned to function as a seamless unit under their leadership, the tactical innovations they developed together, the recognition from Alliance leadership that their partnership represented something new and valuable in military cooperation. Ask me in 50 years, he said. When we've finished revolutionizing interspecies military relations and training the next generation of Alliance officers to see cooperation as strength rather than compromise. Zara Lynn's laugh was bright and musical, the sound that had first made Jake realize he was falling for someone extraordinary. 50 years. You realize that's a significant commitment, even by Cytherian standards. Good thing I'm used to significant commitments, Jake replied, pulling her closer. After all, I accepted Cytherian courtship without fully understanding what I was getting into. Everything since then has just been following through on that initial leap of faith. As they prepared to return to the command center and resume the military exercise, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them from an embarrassing diplomatic incident to a partnership that was reshaping Alliance military culture. Their success had required adapting to challenges neither of them had anticipated, learning to navigate cultural differences that had no established protocols, and proving that love could flourish even under the intense scrutiny of interspecies politics. "Jake," Zaralyn said as they reached the entrance to the command center, "there's something I've been meaning to tell you." "What's that?" Her skin shifted to the warm gold patterns he'd learned meant affection mixed with mischief. "That comment you made about my anatomy? You were right. It is absolutely perfect." Jake burst into laughter, drawing amused looks from their mixed-species crew. "Admiral, you realize that if anyone overheard that, we'd have another diplomatic incident on our hands." "Let them overhear," Zaralyn replied with the confidence of someone who had learned to turn potential disasters into opportunities. After all, it worked out so well the first time. As they returned to their duties, coordinating the complex dance of ships and strategy that had become their specialty, Jake marveled at how dramatically his life had changed because of one moment of unfiltered honesty. He'd learned that sometimes the most embarrassing mistakes could lead to the most rewarding outcomes, that courage could bridge any cultural gap, and that finding someone who challenged you to be better than you thought possible was worth any amount of public scrutiny or professional complication. The interspecies military integration program would launch in 3 months, with Jake and Zaralyn at its head. They would train thousands of officers from dozens of species, developing new protocols for cooperation and understanding that would influence Alliance military policy for generations. Their partnership had become proof that differences in species, culture, and background could be sources of strength rather than barriers to overcome. And it had all begun with an accidentally honest observation about a Cytherian admiral's posterior anatomy, delivered at the worst possible moment to the best possible audience. Some stories, Jake reflected as he watched Zaralyn coordinate the final phases of their tactical exercise with the kind of brilliant competence that still took his breath away, began with embarrassment and ended with transformation. The trick was having the courage to see opportunity in disaster and the wisdom to recognize when someone extraordinary was offering you the chance to be extraordinary alongside them. In the end, that was what made their partnership work, not just the professional compatibility or the personal attraction, but the shared understanding that the most important victories were won not through perfect execution, but through the willingness to take risks, make mistakes, and learn from both with someone who believed in the same impossible possibilities.